Well, good evening. I think we'll make a start. It's clear to see that those that are here, that made it here, you've all got the thick coats on, and great foresight from all of you. So welcome to this, the next Dean's Lecture for 2014. It's a very special one indeed, and I'll say more about that in a second, but I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are traditional custodians of this land, and I pay respects to elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation. So as you know, tonight is the Jack Keating Memorial Lecture, and I'm delighted that Jack's wife, Lynelle Gibson, and Gabrielle Keating, Jack's sister, are both here. I knew I'd get it. But tonight's lecture is presented in partnership with the Australian College of Educators, and I take this opportunity to thank them for joining with us in setting this memorial lecture up last year, but also in their ongoing sponsorship of the event. So tonight is partly about honouring Jack Keating, and Jack was a Fellow of the Australian College of Educators, a Professor and Leader of Education Policy and Leadership here in the Graduate School, a colleague of mine and many others in attendance this evening, and a man who we all hold in very high esteem indeed, both within the Graduate School, the University and beyond, for his substantial contribution to education. This memorial lecture, I think, is a fitting way to honour Jack. And there are other ways we're doing that as well. We have set up the Jack Keating Fund, which has been established as a formal trust at the university. And the purpose of this fund is to support policy research in the field of education with a social justice focus. So the university is particularly grateful for the support it's received, not only from Jack's family, who I've already acknowledged, and also from the group that I describe as the Jack Keating Fund Advisory Committee, and some are here tonight: Andrew Use, David Huggins, Graham Marshall, but others on that committee include Steve Braxton, Ellen Koshland, Terry Moore and Dale Surgett, Hayden Ray Smith. They've all worked closely with me to establish the trust. So it's now over $126,000, and we had an initial target of $250,000, so we're over halfway. And I think that, and if you are interested in being involved, there will be some flyers outside. But I anticipate that the inaugural Jack Keating Fund Scholar will be in place in 2015, which is very exciting indeed. But back to the other purpose of tonight's lecture, and that is about John Polesel. We have a tradition in the university of a public address by professors, new professors at the university. John isn't that new because he was made promoted to professor in 2011. But this is technically and is his inaugural professorial lecture, and I'm pleased that Philomena Murray, Professor Philomena Murray, John's wife, is here, but also his son Stephen. I don't know if you're on the professorial track yet, Stephen, but we wish you well in that. So I've asked one of John's colleagues, David Beckett, to move the vote of thanks at the end. But David not only is one of John's colleagues, but he's also the Deputy Dean, and he will present the vote of thanks. And after that, I'll invite you, of course, out in the foyer. Some have already asked, will there be drinks afterwards? And I've said most definitely, and you need them tonight. But anyway, let me say something about John Polesel, and it'll be clear why he got promoted to Professor. But he is Professor of Education. He's also our Associate Dean International in the Graduate School. He teaches across a range of programs. And I think the Master of Education Policy International is the one that's really grown and is the one that I think he would hold in the highest of esteem of all of the things that he does in terms of teaching. He's supervising currently 11 doctoral students. He manages a range of research projects focused on upper secondary education and transitions from school. His research interests include issues of inequality, the relationship between schools and vocational training, models of education and training, and youth transition systems in Australia and internationally. He's currently leading a national ARC study of the partnerships that schools form to deliver VET programs and recently led a destination survey of New South Wales secondary school students for the New South Wales Government. He's played a leading role in winning and conducting over 50 projects, research projects in education, research grants, consultancies. He's written or co-written over 100 journal articles, book chapters and commissioned reports, most of which he's first author. And some, of course, are in the most prestigious journals, the Oxford Review of Education, Comparative Education, the Journal of Education Policy, the Australian Journal of Education and European Journal of Vocational Training, and chapters in major Springer publications. So it's, John, great pleasure indeed to see you, see your trajectory through the graduate school and your leadership, and I welcome you to the lectern to present your professorial address. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you, Field. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for braving the cold and the wind and the rain to come here tonight. I appreciate it. It's a great honour to give this lecture in Jack Keating's memory. Jack Keating and I were colleagues and friends, and I'd like to welcome Laniel here tonight too, and Gabrielle, his sister. Thank you for coming too. Jack and I shared a strong interest in the topic I want to talk about tonight, which is school-based vocational programs and applied learning. This has always been a difficult area in theoretical terms. It straddles research across curriculum and senior certificates, and also the links that schools have to form with the world of work and further study. In policy terms, it's challenging. It requires cooperation between factions that seem to exist in every education system. We might call them the schools division and the technical or training division. Of course, those names vary across jurisdictions and over time. It also raises quite important issues regarding equity. Do vocational programs create opportunities for our disadvantaged students? Do they engage them? Do they keep them in school? Do they provide them with effective pathways? These are all important questions. Or do they simply manage these difficult students so that schools can get on with what they see as their really important business, which for many schools is getting kids into university? In recent years, I think VET in schools has been one of the highest profile policy interventions in our secondary schools, and it's affected the curriculum significantly. It also reflects a view that schools should be better preparing young people for the world of work. But of course, vocational education and applied learning are not some new idea that we've just thought of in the last 20 years. They actually have a long history, and I want to start with a bit of that history because I think it has a lot to tell us. I've gone back a long way, as you can see. This is 1901 in our city of Melbourne. This was the year of federation when the individual colonies became states in our newly formed nation. Melbourne was actually one of the last of the large capital cities to be founded, but the discovery of gold quickly made it the biggest, in fact by 1855. And of course in 1901 Melbourne became the temporary capital of the new federation. It was an interesting time for Australia. It was a growing economy. There were labour shortages in key areas, both in the trades and also in technological areas. The state at the time, and particularly the government of the state of Victoria, argued that this new country needed young people who had scientific skills and technological literacies and competencies. And if you think about it, it's not the kind of statement that's so different from what we hear nowadays. Because again, the state is arguing now in 2014 that we need young people with these literacies and these competencies in order to further our economy and improve their own prospects. They're typically the sorts of needs which see governments turn to schools to help them solve their problems. And again, that's not something that's new to us. Typically, governments will turn to schools to solve all sorts of problems, including many problems which the schools didn't have much to do with creating in the first place. Back in 1901, though, the Victorian government faced a problem in trying to deliver on this. It had an extensive network of government primary schools, but it did not have any state secondary schools. So searching for an instrument to develop these technological and scientific competencies was going to be quite difficult without a school to help them do it. All of the secondary schools at this time were actually like this one, Melbourne Grammar, independent religious schools. They charged high fees. They included in their curriculum both the modern subjects like maths and chemistry and physics and modern languages, but also the classical subjects like Latin and ancient Greek. What they didn't teach, of course, were trade or technical subjects. The absence of state secondary schools meant, of course, that the state didn't have any way to train the young people that it needed, or that the economy needed. So in response, the government argued that it needed to establish a secondary school of its own, a school which would actually address the need for trained workers. Oh, and by the way, they thought this might actually also help give better access to education to the poorer members of society. And a lot of what I'm saying is actually quoted directly from Vision and Realisation, which was a Department of Education history. The proposal, though, didn't please schools like Melbourne Grammar because they felt that the state was encroaching on their territory, stealing their market, if you like. The government responded very carefully by saying that they didn't want to compete with the private schools, that in fact what they didn't want to do was to transmit, and I quote, general culture, but rather, and I quote again, they wished to prepare the sons of the working classes for some special trade or occupation. As you can see, the needs of the daughters of the working classes didn't really get a look in. I'm going to return to that gender theme because I think that now, like back in 1901, girls have been the losers in this debate. And so, 1905, this school opened. I think most of you would recognise it. It was originally called the Melbourne Continuation School, and we now know it as Melbourne High School, of course. It's a select entry, elite high school. It's a boys' school. But in 1905, this was actually supposed to be our first vocational school, which a lot of people are quite surprised at. A student of mine in one of my master's classes who teaches at Melbourne High told me that the wings on either side were actually the metalwork and woodwork workshops in the original school, but obviously haven't been used as such for many, many years. I think in reality we can question whether this school was ever really intended to train workers in the way that the government at the time argued. Certainly the curriculum was not exclusively vocational, and even in 1905 the Premier at the time, Thomas Bent, made it clear, it was an unfortunate name actually because he became associated with corruption. Thomas Bent made it clear at the time that one of the tasks of the school was to help poor children get access to education. So even though he was a liberal, he actually did see a social justice perspective in the establishment of this school. Interestingly, the establishment hated him, and one of the main reasons they hated him was that he spoke with an Australian accent. So almost certainly couldn't be trusted. His comment, though, about poor children did, of course, arouse the private schools, deeper suspicions. They saw this as confirmation, in a sense, that the state really was out to take over their territory. In 1908, the government recommended the building of a lot more schools like this one, and a whole lot of high schools began to open up. And of course that confirmed their deeper suspicions. But what was interesting was that the original technical and vocational aims of this school and the ones that followed very quickly receded, and in fact almost disappeared within a few years. So a lot of these schools had industrial, agriculture, vocational subjects, which were supposed to actually produce those competencies that the state wanted. But actually what happened was that the students ignored these subjects, and they chose instead those subjects which would get them into university. In retrospect, this is understandable. This school and those that followed provided a means for students who couldn't afford to go to Wesley or Scotch or Xavier or Melbourne Grammar. It provided them with an opportunity to actually get secondary schooling which would lead them into university for the first time. So in fact, the students who went there, the children who went there, chose the subjects which would get them into university and ignored the vocational subjects. Looking back, I think you could argue that this was actually a very positive step in the democratisation of our secondary schooling system. However, what it didn't do, and this is the problem that I'm talking about tonight, what it didn't do was to provide the state with the technical and scientific competencies which it said the economy needed. And so in 1912, a decision was taken to establish the first technical schools, and a whole batch of them were opened at this particular time. The argument of the authorities was that the high schools were neglecting technical training and that they were pursuing a curriculum largely designed to get kids into university. So there was a need for a different kind of school. And you can see it's quite a different school, isn't it, in terms of architecture from what we've just seen. This was Sunshine Technical School. Not long after, in 1916, the first girls' junior technical school was opened. And in 1922, a department history that was written at the time noted that these schools were, I quote, endeavouring, while continuing the education of the girl on generous lines, to give her an intelligent interest in some kind of occupation. So not exactly inspiring as an aim. The girls in the bottom right of the photo are actually making hot water bottles for the Red Cross. The battle, though, to establish the technical schools didn't finish once these schools opened. There were many people within the government who opposed them, and the fears they expressed was that it would lead to social selection, or a division of labour, if you like, with one group of schools leading the middle-class kids into university and then into the professions, while another group of schools led the poorer children into the trades and into factory jobs. I want to spend a few minutes looking at this debate because it's actually a strikingly modern debate, and I think it actually helps us understand a lot of what's happening in the whole vocational sphere in 2014. The debate about technical schools really focused at the time on two quite extraordinary personalities. They were both strong intellects, they were also bitter enemies. The first was Donald Clark. Donald Clark was one of 7 children born into a strict Presbyterian family. His father was a labourer on the Geelong-Ballarat Railway, and Clark himself graduated from this university with a Bachelor of Civil Engineering. He became director of the Bairnsdale School of Mines and later the Bendigo School of Mines. So he had quite a stellar career from a very early age. As early as 1890, he was writing letters complaining about the antagonism of the Department of Education towards VET. So this was something that bothered him quite deeply. He was an interesting fellow. He was an expert in mining processes, and he actually did a whole lot of original research which led to him becoming the first Master of Mining Engineering to graduate from the University of Melbourne. So he was a practitioner, but he was also a teacher. He was widely regarded as a brilliant teacher, and in 1911 he became the first Chief Inspector of Technical Schools in the Department of Education, with the aim, of course, to opening the first school a year later. The second protagonist in this debate was Martin Hanson. Hanson was the son of a farmer, and he won a scholarship to Scotch. He became a teacher too, and while he was teaching, doing his apprenticeship as a teacher, he obtained a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Law, and also a Master of Arts from this university while he was actually teaching at schools including University High School and Wesley. Again, he was known as an excellent teacher. He produced a number of successful textbooks in areas which would surprise us today because they varied from physics to poetry. And he joined the department in 1909. Now, the two didn't see eye to eye. Clark objected to the inclusion of technical and vocational streams within the high schools because he saw them, and this is where our quote comes from, he saw them as a way of separating the professional and the industrial, the sheep and the goats within the schools. He quickly won the first battle, of course, as we know, because he actually managed to get tech schools opened in 1912, set them up as separate schools. Hanson, though, hated this dichotomous system of techs and highs because he believed that this kind of blatant tracking or streaming would actually lead to social selection and what he called class consciousness, as he put it. It's interesting, if we look at Barry Magore's work in much more recent times, his analyses of PISA data actually support the view that if you have tracked systems, they actually do tend to increase the gap between high achievers and low achievers. So Hanson did argue with some weight of evidence behind him, even though, of course, the PISA came much later. You could argue that their views actually emerged from their differences in upbringing. Clark was a labourer's son and he came up through the vocational system. Hanson was a grammar school boy. He taught in elite private and state schools. I think, though, if you go down that line, it's a little simplistic because Hanson, from what we know, was not an elitist. He was actually as passionate about working class participation in education as Clark was. Hanson, though, believed that a divided system was inherently anti-democratic and socially divisive, and these are terms that he used. Over time, he increasingly argued that the curriculum and the pedagogies in both types of system, in both types of schools, would actually become too narrow. He argued that in the high schools, the freedom that the teachers had to focus on the most academically gifted kids actually meant that they would neglect good applied learning, good inclusive pedagogies, good interesting teaching. He argued that in the technical schools the opposite would happen. Teachers would actually neglect the important discipline knowledge, the subjects, the powerful subjects that are important and which he believed all children should have access to, not just the middle class kids. So he worked tirelessly within the department to merge the technical and secondary divisions, and by doing so to bring together the technical and the high schools into a unified system of schools. But Clark fought him the whole way. Clark insisted that a separate system of technical schools was needed to ensure that the VET, the applied learning, wouldn't become neglected and marginalised. Clark interestingly argued that the biggest losers in any merger would actually be the working class kids who were suffering the most at this particular time. And we've come up now to the depression of the late 1920s. So he was talking with some authority behind him too. Interestingly, by the time that we get to this particular stage of the arguments, 1928, Hanson was senior to Clark. By 1928, he'd actually become Director General of Education. So you would have thought that he was well placed to win this battle and that he would win the battle. In fact, what happened next was quite surprising. Clark continued to fight behind the scenes, and in 1929, a Labor government was actually unexpectedly elected. Well, the Labor government bypassed Hanson and it went straight to Clark for advice. So it bypassed the Director General and went to one of his minions, if you like. It was pretty evident that the Labor Party didn't like his plans. They were concerned that what he was doing was attacking the technical school system, and probably more important from their point of view, that he was attacking the working class voters, their constituents who'd actually voted them in. And so in fact, and of course they were the biggest users of the technical schools. So, Hanson's planned merger failed. The technical schools survived another 50 years. Who was right, Hanson or Clark? It's a question which isn't really just about a long past piece of history. It's actually quite relevant now in 2014 and looking into the future as well. I think the story illustrates that some of the fundamental issues haven't changed. There are two main themes that I would draw from this. The first one is that Hanson's fears that a divided curriculum would be socially selective were actually well-founded. My own research and the research of a lot of others over the years has shown that the social background of students who do vocational subjects is very different from the social background of the kids who don't. And we still, of course, have private schools and selective high schools or pseudo-selective high schools which still largely ignore applied learning and instead focus on providing what's a pretty traditional university preparatory curriculum to their students. But Clark's view is also right, I think. Clark's view that VET will struggle to establish a role within the sphere of secondary schooling, I think, is still the case. I think just like in 1905, many parents and students still see it as a second-class option, as a second-best option. And many teachers still don't believe that it's a legitimate part of secondary schooling. Now, I don't want to overstate that last remark. I think there has been change, and there are exemplary schools, and we know which ones they are, which are working in the VET space, and I'm going to talk about one of them a bit later on. But I think there are still a lot of schools which don't see applied learning as core business. So before we leave the 20th century, let's turn to a proposition from the sociologist Emile Durkheim, who wrote these words 1 year before Melbourne Continuation School, or Melbourne High School, opened. We've observed a series of historical phenomena. Let's see what ideas they may justify us informing about what secondary education is. The preliminary and purely negative observation is that secondary education has never had an essentially vocational goal. I think this provides some important theoretical backdrop to both of the themes that I've mentioned, but particularly the second one, which is the difficulty that secondary schools in many spheres still have in accommodating applied learning. So, just to bring us up to the present, this is a thumbnail sketch of what's happened here in Victoria. Hanson's defeat in 1929 didn't really end the debate. It did continue for many years and it remained bitter. But politically it was fairly clear to leaders in both parties that it would be suicide to try to close the technical schools. They were seen as too important, and they were particularly seen as too important for one particular section of the electorate. So they survived, in fact, until the late 1980s. Most of the other states in Australia, interestingly, got rid of them much earlier. We were the last state to close our technical schools. And in the picture you can see the rather derelict and graffiti covered facade of Collingwood Tech in Johnson Street. This was actually in the very first group of tech schools to open in 1912, and it survived until the very end in 1986. It's now the home of Circus Oz. So I do hope they get rid of the graffiti. We now have, in a sense, what Hanson wanted so long ago, which is applied learning delivered within the structure of comprehensive high schools. The question is, does it work? Have we eliminated streaming and social selection, which is what he wanted? Maybe we're just tracking the students a bit later. How does VET fare within these more mainstream settings? This is still an important question, and this is what obviously worried Donald Clark so much. Do we know if applied learning is still being marginalised and diluted and ignored in the way that it was in the original high schools back in 1905 and following? And I think, in addition, the underlying question, which is probably the really important one, how do we actually address skill shortages? If we've tried these different approaches, how do we address skill shortages now, and are we doing it well? I know you're trying to work out the connection. The two themes that I've mentioned come through very strongly in the recent research. Vocational education and training remains low in the status hierarchy of education. It's a tool used by government to fix problems in many cases, just like the skill shortages back in 1901 or unemployment of returned soldiers after the Second World War. And Michael Young argues that it has a weak knowledge base. This is important too because it means that we're risking the learning of young people if we focus on narrow vocational competencies instead of the broader generic competencies and the broader cultural base, which actually all young people need and which all young people should have a right to. Some years ago, Prince Charles was arguing that if we view education in narrow utilitarian terms, we can risk destroying the love of learning. Now, that kind of argument, of course, it can cross the line into a form of elitism. But I think there is an important point here. Our schools are not just here to serve the labour market's need for skilled labour. They're not just here to serve the needs of industry and employers. They're actually here to serve the needs of young people. And that means that they have a responsibility to form well-adjusted, responsible citizens who can read a newspaper, who can vote, who can think about the society and who can make informed decisions, and who can also be happy and well-adjusted young people. And finally, the research also tells us that wherever we offer VET, and this comes across from the literature right across the world, whether it's in separate VET providers like we see in Germany or Denmark, or in more comprehensive unified systems like we see in Sweden or Australia for that matter, the students who do the VET subjects are consistently more likely to come from poorer social backgrounds. So, where do we stand now? The majority of children in Australia now complete school. It's about 80%. But of that 80%, only about half at the most actually go to university. So we're looking at about 4 in 10 going to university, 6 in 10 who don't. And of course, some of those 6 in 10 don't even finish school. And I think it's important to remember that that 6 in 10 is actually the majority here. I would argue that the culture of our secondary schools is still one which valorises the university entry pathway for the minority, for the 4, at the expense of the majority. And this is the same thing, of course, which worried Donald Clark 100 or so years ago. Vocational and applied learning, I think, still find it hard to get a look in within a policy sphere which still places so much emphasis on university entry. There are a number of reasons this happens. One of them is that vocational learning tends to be a very minor part of what young people do in Year 11 and Year 12. It usually means that they enrol in 1 or 2 subjects as part of a broader senior certificate like the VCE. In some states, there's actually a limit on how much VET you're allowed to do. And so it's rare for students to even do enough VET subjects to get a basic vocational qualification like a Certificate 1 or a Certificate 2. What that means is that the senior certificates in Australia, the VCE, the HSC, the QCE, and all the others, still really reflect what Durkheim was saying so long ago, that schooling, secondary schooling is not about teaching vocational skills, it's still about doing subjects which get you into university. So you see we have this paradox. We have senior secondary certificates focused primarily on university entry, but most students don't go to university. We have a few vocational subjects for those who don't, but they don't actually form a coherent or integrated program which will actually provide an effective pathway. In a sense, they operate more like electives and play a fairly minor role. Then, of course, there's the other issue, and this is the one that worried Hanson, and this is the issue of social selection. This slide shows us the role played by private and public schools in the provision of VET subjects here in Victoria. Now, as you can see, by far, numerically, the largest number of students are in state schools and the largest number of VET students are in state schools. But proportionally, they also actually make up the largest share, 31% of all the kids in state schools. In the Catholic schools, it's about 25%. And in the wealthiest group of schools, the independent schools, it's less than 13%. So you can see a clear difference in the roles played by the different types of schools, the different sectors. I'll bring this together in a moment. Let's look first though at the social background of the students themselves. And this chart is based on a categorisation that we did of all the students in the upper secondary curriculum in Victoria, so that's years 11 and 12. So we divided them into 5 equal groups, from the highest socioeconomic status on the left to the lowest on the right. And these categories are based on census characteristics like income, job, educational level, labour market characteristics of the areas in which the students live. Then we looked at what percentage were enrolled in vocational subjects in each group, and if all the social groups were equally likely to do VET, then they should be even. But in fact, what you can see is a clear social pattern. The 2 poorest quintiles of VET on the right are actually more than twice as likely to be doing vocational subjects as the wealthiest quintile on the left. It's an interesting dip for the group on the far right of the screen. We suspect that probably this is the group that comes from families the most disengaged from work and probably with higher levels of unemployment. So that, in a sense, may explain the dip in vocational enrolments at that end of the chart. But overall, you can see that as socioeconomic status falls, the VET enrolments tend to increase. Let's bring these two things together, school sector and socioeconomic status. Here we can see the relationship between the two. The independent schools on the far right actually enrol children from the wealthiest, most highly educated families on the basis of their socioeconomic status value, the CEFA value. And they also have the lowest enrolments in VET subjects. The Catholic schools are close to the middle. They're a little bit above average in socioeconomic status, a little bit below average in enrolments. And the government schools here on the left have the lowest proportion of children from wealthy, highly educated families, but they also have the highest proportion of students in VET. There is a very small group in the top left, which are the adult sector students enrolled in TAFE and other adult sector environments. Why is this important? I think it's important because what we see is the wealthiest and best resourced schools over here actually taking the least responsibility, or I won't say taking, that sounds a bit of value judgment, I'll say bearing the least responsibility for vocational programs which are actually more expensive to deliver. And we know that. It is more expensive to deliver vocational subjects than to go in and teach French or maths or English. In comparison, we have the government schools which have the lowest levels of total per capita funding, and you've only got to look at the My School website to confirm that. And they are the schools which actually have the heaviest responsibility to deliver the most expensive and difficult programs, and often to quite small cohorts too, because a lot of state schools tend to have very small numbers, particularly those in the most marginalised and disadvantaged areas. So you can see a double whammy of disadvantage. It's pretty clear that Martin Hanson's worry about vocational learning being linked to social selection is still a problem. Now, these are macro patterns. We've got 120,000 students sitting in this chart. One of the questions that we're able to examine through our research was whether these same patterns would actually be replicated at the school level. These data come from a case study from one of our recent Australian Research Council grants. What they show is a predominantly working class school in a very poor suburb of northern Queensland. Most of the students in this school do vocational subjects. And in fact, there's very few students from wealthy backgrounds. In a sense, there was social selection in the broader environment of the kids before they even got to the school, because the wealthier kids in this community tend to go to the local Catholic and independent schools. In the chart, what we actually see is that the children from primary educated, secondary educated and trades apprenticeship family backgrounds, and these were based on the father's occupation because that was the best data we had, you can see they're all reasonably equally likely to be doing vocational subjects, and then suddenly you hit the kids who've got university-educated fathers and it drops right down. So you can see, in a sense, the same pattern in this, what is actually quite a homogeneously disadvantaged setting. You still see the same pattern occurring that you see happening right across systems as a whole. And again, it confirms Hanson's concern about social selection, although here it's happening within a school, not between schools. The research actually tells us that the impact of family background on track selection goes well beyond its impact on achievement. So the impact is greater than just the achievement, the impact that achievement might have on selection. Again, still focusing on this same school, Rainforest High School, Donald Clark's concern also comes through. And that was the concern about the weakness of vocational learning within a very academic culture. Now, in this case, we're not talking about a very academic culture. We're talking about a school which is actually dealing mainly with disadvantaged kids, most of whom actually do vocational subjects. But the teachers I spoke to when I visited the school told me, well, yes, VET is useful, it provides options, it engages kids, it even helps kids, it even helps prevent kids from dropping out. But having said that, most of our teachers would prefer to focus on the kids going to university. Now, if we look at the My School website for this school, it tells us the destinations of the kids, and what it tells us is that 20% of the kids go to university. Okay, so we've got teachers telling us that the most important thing is to focus on the kids going to university when they form 1/5 of the school's population. You can see that from the comments here that it's the academic subjects which get priority. If there are teacher shortages, well, maths is more important than VET, so that's where we'll put them. If a teacher is made permanent, then she or he will be allocated to a proper subject, and I particularly liked that term, proper subjects. So in a largely disadvantaged setting, which is going to put the majority of its kids straight into the labour market the minute they finish school, we can see that VET subjects are not regarded as important because they're not real subjects. Now, I think this is a deep problem of educational culture. We know from the research of Stephen Ball that teachers will often compete to teach the most academically gifted kids and to work in the most academic streams. And why wouldn't you? In a lot of cases, these are the kids who are going to stimulate teachers intellectually. But is that what teaching is all about, or is that all it's about? In part, and again this is from the same school, in part these teachers' concerns reflect the fact that it's not actually easy to deliver vocational learning. When you remove students to do work placements, it's disruptive, drives other teachers mad. The majority of teachers see VET as involving more work, there's more organisation, there's more phone calls to make, you have to link up with employers, you have to link up with TAFE, you have to link up with everyone else who's delivering subjects in the vocational area. In the teacher's mind, it's just more difficult than going in and teaching maths or English. And so the teachers, when I spoke to them, would say to me, why would we want to teach VET? It's longer hours, it's more work, it's more organisation, and in the end, it actually won't help my promotion prospects, which is a pretty telling admission. So again, I think this relates to the culture of secondary schooling, not in all schools, but in a lot of them. And I think it's a culture which in some schools is actually quite hostile to vocational education and training. I'm going to finish with the issue of gender. As I mentioned earlier, VET was largely conceived in its early days as something for boys. That's no longer the case, but nevertheless there's a lot of evidence that it still works differently for young men and young women. If there are problems with social selection, there are also problems with gender selection. Some of the recent feminist literature suggests that the increasing proportions of girls in maths or sciences hasn't yet translated into better post-school opportunities. I think the same kind of longer term issues are also important for VET, because a lot of the inequality that we see at the school level is actually reflected in the labour market. The average male wage is still higher. Girls still have a 9% of the total board positions available in the top 200 companies in Australia. If you look at it in VET, the opportunities to go into apprenticeships, which are the strongest pathway into high-paying work, are still mainly taken by boys. And I realise I'm running out of time, so I'll go through this quickly. These are actually the outcomes from VCAL, which is the Victorian Certificate of Applied Learning. It's an alternative certificate offered here in Victoria, a vocational certificate. You can see that for boys, the most popular destinations are apprenticeships. And overall, about 60% of these boys go into further educational training. Now, given that these are actually the weakest learners in our system, that is a good outcome. Okay, it's a bit different for the girls. The proportion of girls getting apprenticeships is 8%. As a result, the proportion of girls in these at-risk destinations over here on the right are actually much higher than the proportion of boys. It's 40% compared with 30%. And what we're talking about is kids who are inactive, that is not working but not looking for work, unemployed, or working in part-time work. In some cases, that part-time work is very short hours. And again, you can see that here. For those kids who do get jobs, we do see a picture of mainly low-paid work. It's dominated by two fields, retail and food handling. And I characterise these as turning hamburgers or pushing buttons on a cash register. There are large gender differences. The girls are most likely to go into those two fields. The boys are spread more widely across other occupations as well, which includes some of the more promising career pathways in building trades and automotive. And that's, of course, also where the apprentices are. So it suggests a better transition for boys with better job security and better longer-term prospects. Boys are also much more likely to be working full-time and longer hours. So, applied learning. Does it provide effective pathways for our young people? Or is Michael Young right, and are we shortchanging young people by channeling them into pathways which deny them the powerful knowledge that they need to succeed? Are we socially engineering our society so that we transfer one group of kids into low-paid, casualised, residualised work while we send our middle-class children to university? And of course, the other question, do schools still see VET as some kind of hostile foreign invader? I would argue that applied learning, vocational programs, despite their shortcomings, have given a space to those students who 20 years ago would not have found a niche in our schools. I believe it's an important tool for engaging and re-engaging weaker learners, but not just weaker learners, also different learners. Because the fact is that good, strong, applied learning pedagogies benefit all kids, not just the kids who might need those sort of pedagogies the most. The extent of social selection, though, remains a major concern. I think there are some things we can do to improve the situation. I think, first of all, we need to prioritise VET in the allocation of staff and physical resources, like the maths teacher in the Queensland school that we looked at. And I think we need to acknowledge the agency of students who are telling us that they want applied learning pedagogies and that they will actually drop out of school if we don't manage to engage them. I think we need to do this by providing a coherent and integrated vocational program, not a piecemeal approach which focuses on individual subjects which are unconnected. And I think we need to think about VET as a pathway not straight into the labour market but into further study, a way of engaging young people with broad industry areas and broad families of occupations. I think we can't pretend anymore that completing Year 12, whether or not you do VET, is going to provide you with a pathway into a skilled, well-paid job with a great career when you complete school, because those kinds of jobs really disappeared for 17 and 18-year-olds a long time ago. Interestingly, when we talk to the parents of a lot of these kids, because they're still thinking about it in terms of their own schooling, it's something that they still have to catch up with. It's an important point to make with them. I'm very proud of the research that members of my team here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education have done over many years in this area. Kira Clark's work for the NCVER on VET in schools policies across the nation and across all the different jurisdictions, and that was fun doing that, collecting the data and listening to the opposing voices. Suzanne Rice's work on themed senior secondary programs, also here in Victoria, as well as a huge range of research studies conducted by Jack Keating himself, but also Veronica Volkoff, Lisa Wheelerhan, Mary Lay, Gosha Klatt, Shelley Gillis, Nikki Dulfer and Claire O'Hanlon, I hope I've mentioned everyone, have all contributed to, I think, a lot of the emerging policies in this field. And as examples, I'd like to include the thinking behind the industry pathways here in Victoria, and also the national trade cadetships at the national level. Although I have to say at the national level, I'm not sure if they're going to survive the new federal government. I think finally, I think this needs its own slide because I think this is probably one of the most important points. Industry and employers really need to step up. It's no accident that countries like Austria and Germany have effective VET systems and also have very, very low youth unemployment, in fact almost as low as our total unemployment here in Australia. Unlike Australia, which seems to see the market as the solution to every problem we have, from unemployment to skill shortages, in these countries there's actually a strong directive and cooperative effort by government, trade unions, schools and educators to design and deliver education and training which benefits both the students but also the economy. I think the market won't do this on its own. A neoliberal laissez-faire approach will simply maintain the status quo. If we're going to ask schools to change, and we ask schools to do lots of things, then I think we can legitimately ask industry to change as well. So to finish on a more positive note, I'd like to give an example of a school where a lot of these things are happening. This is Catholic Regional College Sydenham. It's a trade training centre in Melbourne's northern suburbs, and it has provided a model which works. It provides coherent, integrated programs which are offered in a school culture which actually values applied learning. But it's also a school culture which takes the long view, that sees VET not as a narrow kind of fix-it-tomorrow solution, but as something which will lead young people into further study, further work, further thinking and further experience, and provide pathways down the track. I think that's really important. In the principal, Brendan Watson, and the teachers, we actually see educators who are willing to see beyond the narrow confines of the VCE and the even narrower thinking behind the ATAR, which seems to dominate so many of our schools. Again, I think our role here as a Graduate School of Education has been really important in this. Brendan and a number of his teachers have actually studied here with us. They've listened to our thinking, argued with us, and I think contributed to the debate in a really important way. So to finish, in a sense, Catholic Regional College Sydenham is a school which has taken on a lot of the responsibilities which industry should be taking in Australia. It provides a lot of the workplace training which students need. The students needed experience in a bakery, so the school opened one. The students needed experience in a restaurant, so the school opened one. And that's Nick Weiler, another ex-student of ours, cooking some of his wonderful food. But this is a lot to ask schools, and that's why I believe that employers and industry need to come on board. A long time ago, Bob Hawke had this idea that you could bring government, unions and employers together in something he called an accord. I think this is exactly the kind of neo-corporatist political thinking that we need in this policy space. Schools don't create unemployment, and I don't think they can fix it on their own. Schools don't create skill shortages, and I don't think they can fix them on their own. So if as a society we feel that we need to keep telling schools what to do, and the media certainly isn't shy about doing that, then I think we need to help them do it better and take some responsibility as well. Thank you.
When you drive down the Nepean Highway, it's still him. Yeah. When you drive down the Nepean Highway and you get to North Brighton, you'll see the large statue of Sir Thomas Bent. His feet are in North Brighton shops. His gaze is out across Bentley. It's named after him. Yes. It's a point of tension for Sir Thomas. He was charged with, he was suspected of corruption, even though he was a worthy Premier of Victoria. So this is a way of first saying that I appreciated the historical context in what John gave us today. I went to Ballarat High School. Lynn Yates is here. We're both alumni. Yep. When I was there in the 60s, we went out there at recess time onto the playing fields, which were undulating. Why? They were grassed over, but originally they were where you were learning ploughing. Who was learning ploughing? The sons of the farmers. The sons of the squatters were down the road at Ballarat Grammar. Okay? So Ballarat Agricultural High School, 1907, is a fine example of the Melbourne High heritage, you know? So I can remember trying to kick a ball across these undulating playing fields. Ploughing wasn't taught there, but now Ballarat High School is, well, not, I think it's selective. It's a bit like Melbourne High. It's the public school to go to in Ballarat, you know? They're proud of their rowing field on Lake Wendouree. And again, up here, the 1888 building, the first teachers' college, one of the first in the world, 1872 Education Act. Open a school and close a jail. That was part of the parliamentary debates in the Victorian Parliament, even earlier than what John reminded us of tonight. Very grateful for the historical context, very rich in this state. Secondly, I thought pedagogically, you know, I taught VCE politics and then got out and taught STC. I didn't like the pedagogical conservatism that syllabus, that curriculum thrust upon me. I didn't like the idea you had to teach from the text year in, year out. But by and large, to be blunt, the classroom cultures of Victorian schools are shaped by teaching from the text year in, year out. That's the high status job, as we've heard tonight. That gets you the promotion in the schooling system, as we've heard tonight. That's really a conservative pedagogical approach that served many people's careers very well, but not a lot of kids' careers very well. You know, I think this is really fundamental stuff, and John's brought that to our attention. And finally, I'm interested in the labour market prognosis that we've heard again tonight. Yes, it's grim stuff. I am reminded, though, of Alfred North Whitehead's saying. He co-wrote with Bertrand Russell, both fine mathematicians and educational reformers. I think it was Whitehead who said, "What is education for if it's not to be useful?" If it's not to be useful. Now, this is an argument tonight for a certain form of utility, but you could also argue that Melbourne University, over 160 years, has actually advocated a certain form of utility. Yes, this is how you get to be a doctor or a lawyer. I would have to say that the way we've implemented the Melbourne model and the way in which it's been taken up so well and so enthusiastically by the public has been because we've been able to say, yes, utility is important in education, postpone becoming a doctor until you've got a well-rounded liberal education for the first 3 or 4 years, and then there's a way to be a better doctor and a better lawyer than propositional knowledge, working from the textbook. So I like this idea, this sort of joke we had about proper subjects. Proper subjects. Proper subjects are based on propositional knowledge historically. And that's a kind of a pun I'm making. But the political truth is that a university like this has finally acknowledged that the kind of worker we need is a flexible, adaptive, decisional, agentive person. We just can't get it right in the school space. John, you brought all of this to our attention tonight. It's been a wonderful hour. Thanks so much.